So my name is Rachel and I'm 22 years old, and culturally I identify as a diasporic Korean, specifically diasporic because I don't really fully identify with full Koreanness, nor do I identify with the sort of dominant Pakea culture here either. And so there's this notion that gets used, this term called third culture kid. And so I would say a diasporic Korean / third culture kid is how I culturally identify. My parents came here a year before having me. Especially growing up here and doing all of my schooling here and everything, particularly in sort of the teenage years where you're really desperate to sort of make claims to an identity and for some sense of belonging. It's been a real struggle sort of trying to figure out how I identify culturally. I could never really bring myself to identify fully with being Korean because I've never lived in Korea. I've never really had to experience social life in a Korean setting, because cultural identity isn't just about, it's not about blood, and it is about lived experience and everything. And when my lived experience is quite removed from Korea, it's hard for me to identify as Korean. As a person of colour, living in a dominantly Pākehā setting, I've definitely experienced racial and cultural intolerance. I'll start off on an individual sort of interpersonal level. It'd be say interactions with strangers out in public or something. Sometimes I get strangers coming up to me and assuming that I'm Chinese, and then they'll sort of have a go at me about the housing crisis and how I need to go back to China, and and so those are very interpersonal interactions that indicate some level of racism. I kind of don't know where to begin, to be honest, when it comes to sort of divulging my experiences with it, because it's just been sort of a constant thing that's been there for as long as I can remember. A lot of East Asian racism, anti-Chinese racism, applies to East Asians like me in some ways, because it does get directed at me, because to the others we all look the same. There's misconceptions around me and my family coming here and then taking everyone's jobs and houses. There's a lot to unpack there ideologically, because things like the housing situation and unemployment aren't the fault of Asian people. It's the fault of capitalism, and racism is a system that capitalism depends upon to pit us against each other, and when it becomes a race issue, it becomes a Chinese issue, then that just allows us to forego a broader critique of what is actually the problem, which is capitalism, Overt racism is definitely on the rise. That said, while acknowledging that racism is running rampant, I think it's really important to not presuppose that it wasn't racist before. Because it definitely has been racist, especially this country. It's been sort of premised on some pretty dark colonial histories. Starting off with sort of this wider and mass recognition that that this post-racial utopia that New Zealand has been painted as is fake. Because as migrants, we occupy this quite peculiar space because we've entered this this tense and troubled relationship between the Māori people of this country and then of the Pākehā settlers, and that is a continually troubled relationship that it continues to be really contentious because Māori are still, very much marginalised. As long as those tensions still remain, it's really hard for us to even address the racism across other cultures here as well. A question that I'll get asked a lot is, do you feel more Korean or Kiwi? And I've got a lot of problems with that. What that says to me is it poses this kind of imperative to identify to this binary notion of either Korean or Kiwi, which basically everyone implicitly knows that Kiwi actually means Pākehā, even though the country, it's never been Pākehā. Yeah, I find it quite troubling, the notion of having to identify as a Kiwi as well, particularly because it's a really problematic concept. It posits this oneness that just doesn't exist, this false unity that erases the contradictions and antagonisms and racial tensions in the country. And it's got this real serious sort of historical colonial amnesia that's quite willfully ignorant to the country's settler colonialism. Yeah, and the fact that Kiwi is this homogenous identity that's supposed to include everyone, including tangata whenua, and but it doesn't really, because we all know when we talk about Kiwi, we don't actually mean Māori. And so yeah, there's just it's such a messy term, and to me, do you feel Kiwi usually meant do you feel white, do you feel Pākehā, and it means to and to adopt a Kiwi identity means to approximate to whiteness as close as I can. And so yeah, that's another big reason why I haven't been able to, why I feel really uncomfortable calling myself Kiwi as well. And so the whole being in limbo, sort of floating diasporic Korean is just the term that that sat most comfortably with me. I went to quite a predominantly Pākehā high school, and over there, to be accepted, you had to basically perform whiteness as best as you could, because if you didn't, then you were immediately othered. It was an uncool kind of racialized difference, But then, on the other hand, there's imperative to perform this essential Koreanness as well from the Korean side of my family. From my Korean family who see me and then have frustrations about how much have I assimilated to the dominant Pākehā culture, because in their eyes, I've assimilated quite a lot. Yeah, even though my parents know what racism is like their identities are a little bit more established, they're a little bit more educated on how racism operates and everything, whereas people like me and my brother have had to sort of be born into this setting and then kind of figure it out. My parents haven't had to be teenagers, over here. That's where the intergenerational cultural difference is really quite palpable. We've had a lot of these conversations and we kind of go back and forth, but yeah, I think they find it hard to understand that as a pragmatic, sort of strategic and discerning thing that I've kind of adopted doing over the years growing up as a way of just coping with and navigating a dominantly Pākehā culture. But I can also understand why it can be kind of saddening to my parents who see their Korean daughter but don't really see a Korean daughter, if that makes sense. Yeah. Maybe if people were more mindful of how these things, how things like assimilation become structurally necessary. Yeah, how a lot of these things that cause us grief or that we have trouble with are structural problems rather than each other being the problem. then I think that's a step forward. Yeah, this is something that like me and my friends kind of talk about. So ideally we want a society where racism and gender oppression and class oppression don't exist. And often you'll get told that it's like an impossible utopia, but I think that like a truly progressive politics and thought involves imagining and demanding that impossible, like what we've been told is impossible to get. Recognizing that, and I think maybe people should be less defensive as well when they get called out on something they might have said or done that can play into these like racially oppressive structures. They should be less defensive and sort of not see it as something inherent in themselves, but something that they contribute to and are a part of and have to sort of unlearn and keep learning. We do need to sort of work towards a new world, drawing on the good bits of the old. Yeah, and this new world like should be one where we're not difference isn't something that's weaponized against us. You know, where racial difference isn't something that's used against us to pit us against each other, only to uphold a system that only hurts us.